What was Obi-Wan's greatest pull to the dark side, and how did it almost cause him to repeat Anakin's greatest mistake? As one of the most devoted Jedi to the Order, it's difficult to imagine that Obi-Wan would ever feel the draw to the dark side of the Force. Yet, if one had to think of a specific instance to cause it, one might point to the moment when he watched Maul kill Qui-Gon. In that moment, his rage flared, and he was able to contend with the Sith assassin blow for blow, until Maul proved that anger was the ally of the Sith and the enemy of the Jedi. Maul would later even tell Obi-Wan in the Clone Wars that his rage unbalances him, which is not the Jedi way. In a handful of instances, we have examples of Obi-Wan losing his cool and letting his feelings drive his actions. However, they were more than often just that, feelings. Rarely has Obi-Wan ever felt the desire to actually give in to the dark side fully, and knowingly wield it as a source of his power. But that desire would soon come to him on the world of Tatooine during his exile following Revenge of the Sith, where Obi-Wan almost gave in to Anakin Skywalker's same mistake and slaughtered an entire tribe of Tusken Raiders. So join us today as we open a holocron and tell the story of Obi-Wan's greatest pull to the dark side. This event happened just a few mere months after Obi-Wan became Ben Kenobi and settled in exile. He had already handed over Luke to Owen and Beru Lars and made it his sworn mission to look after the boy from a distance, despite Owen's dislike of him doing so. His days were becoming drab and repetitive as Ben had slipped into a deep depression. The single color of the sandy dunes of Tatooine perfectly represented his current emotional mindset. At this point in the timeline, Obi-Wan didn't know that Vader had survived Mustafar, and was convinced that Anakin had truly died, both physically and metaphorically, on the black shore of Mustafar. Every day, Obi-Wan tortured himself by ruminating on the past and remembering in vivid detail the last few hours of the Clone War. Despite knowing it was against the Jedi way, Obi-Wan indulged in the useless what-if scenarios where he crafted the perfect speech to break through to Anakin. All Obi-Wan desired was to see his former Padawan one more time and apologize for everything. That blame that Kenobi carried went on as he realized that because he hadn't been an emotional support for Anakin, that it was his fault that he had turned, especially during the time of the death of his mother. Ben realized that Anakin had instead gone to Padme and gotten married in secret, another thing that Anakin hadn't told his master. All of these things Obi-Wan shoved in his own face in order to reiterate how he failed Anakin as a master, how he was a failed Jedi, and how he would never be anything like Qui-Gon Jinn. Speaking of Qui-Gon, Kenobi hadn't heard anything from his own dead master despite what Yoda had promised him. The grief and isolation was beginning to set in as Obi-Wan realized that his life was now this: Tatooine, the endless desert, nothing. The only thing he really had to look forward to each day was to go watch over Luke. Of course, during the time of this story, Luke is still only a swaddled infant, carried around everywhere by Beru. But one day, Ben was watching over the Lars homestead when they were both going to check on their vaporators. The Tusken tribes had been reported as being more active as of recent, and Kenobi had heard of how Anakin's mother had been taken and murdered by the Tuskens one morning. So Kenobi left nothing to chance. This particular morning, he saw Owen checking the vaporators only to see that they had been stolen. Tusken and Bantha tracks were left behind in the sand, incriminating the perpetrators. Despite Owen's protests, they both knew only Kenobi could bring them back, and that not even an entire militia of farmers were capable of safely facing down the Sand People alone. Obi-Wan then spent the next several hours until sunset tracking the Tuskens, all the while still being tormented by his memories of Anakin burning on the shore. Finally, Kenobi snuck into the camp, using the Force to mask his movements and noises. His plan was to get the vaporators loaded onto a Bantha and hijack it back to the Lars homestead. However, during his escape, he was caught by a sentry who alerted the rest of the men in the camp. As Kenobi ignited his lightsaber and sliced away at Gaddafi sticks, he found himself quickly surrounded by the Sand People. In that moment, Obi-Wan began to think that his Sarisu style of blocking and evading was only going to give the Tuskens more time to group up and coordinate an attack. And that is when he remembered that Anakin had taught him about aggression, what he had learned from Anakin on Mustafar. Suddenly, Obi-Wan found himself on a thought path that he definitely didn't want to be on, as the dark side grabbed the Jedi Master by the throat. Let's now read from the story itself to see his thoughts in this moment. Loathing choked him. The Sand People made nothing and gave back nothing. They merely preyed on the weak. The moisture farmers, who worked back-breaking days, were attacked on raids that often resulted in death and complete destruction. Stealing the evaporators from Owen and Beru's farm would bring on terrible hardship. They had tortured Anakin's mother for a month just to test her resolve. Was it any wonder that Anakin had been left with such a deep, festering wound? He could do this for Anakin. His Padawan was dead. His brother, his son, his friend. He could give Anakin this, a fearsome anger unleashed. Vengeance. Vengeance against the begins in the world with so much darkness inside them that life meant nothing to them. They swallowed life and hope. That was what the Sith counted on. Beings like these. They had taken over the galaxy. They had won. But not here. Not today. He stopped. The Jedi's stillness intrigued them. He held his lightsaber in a way that any Jedi would recognize as the beginning of aggression. He had no hesitation, no doubt that he could vanquish them all, destroy this camp, and destroy every breath of life within it. He felt his anger rise, and he took pleasure in it. It was growing inside him and obliterating everything else. He wanted to be overtaken. He didn't want to be careful. He wanted only the white heat of satisfaction. The Jedi is experiencing the raw emotions that pull one to the dark side. Many believe that using the dark side is simply feeling and acting upon negative emotions. This can be an avenue, but the true way of darkness is acting upon anger and hatred and enjoying it. Here, Obi-Wan was truly ready to give in and allow himself to be consumed. In his mind, he was ironically thinking that he was going to kill all of the Tuskens in Anakin's honor, still having no knowledge of the horrific deed Anakin had done only years prior. Not only that, but the actions of the Sand People reminded him so much of the Sith that it made the Jedi sick. He was willing to give in to the dark side for just a moment, if it meant destroying any facet of the Sith at all. But yet, when Obi-Wan was poised to strike and take out all of his frustration, he had a different pull, one of light, one which was Qui-Gon Jinn. He could feel the presence of his master imploring him not to give in and become like the enemy. We talked before about how during Anakin's rampage against the Tuskens, he had heard Qui-Gon's voice but ignored it. Here, the parallel returns as Qui-Gon once again reaches out to another of his students to keep them from committing the same decision. And unlike Anakin during that time, Kenobi listens to the Jedi Master. Even though he admitted that he didn't want to turn away from his anger, even though it actively went against everything he desired in that moment, Obi-Wan refused to strike out in a way that was of the dark side. And then Obi-Wan remembered another lesson of Qui-Gon's. Always use an enemy's own ways as their weakness. Obi-Wan takes note of how the Tusken Raiders never show skin. In their culture, it was shameful to show any sort of skin whatsoever. Doing so meant tribal disgrace and potentially even death. Master Obi-Wan leapt high above the heads of his attackers, remembering this, and slashed down one of the tents nearby. When the animal skin tarp tore away, it revealed the Tusken mother and her child, both of them with their masks and gloves off, as they had been sitting down to enjoy the evening meal. They shrieked in horror and began to cover themselves with the sand as fast as possible. This action stunned all of the men who had been attacking Kenobi, giving him an opening. Taking his lightsaber in one hand and a gaffi stick in the other, Kenobi jumps back into the fray, hacking and slashing at their clothes and their masks. All of the warriors immediately forget about the fighting and begin to flee, desperately trying to cover themselves. None of the Tuskens could fight back, as their rules and rituals kept them from taking the strike. Obi-Wan had now become something far more than any opponent invading their camp. Obi-Wan had become something supernatural, a wraith that had blown away the concealment of the Sand People's prized possession, their own sight. One which was fiercer than any wind. Once the Tuskens were thrown into a full retreat, Obi-Wan took the rest of the evaporators, hopped on a bantha, and made his way out. The story ends with Ben returning the machines to Owen, who gives him cold and begrudging gratitude. Afterwards, the Jedi returns to his home in the desert, knowing that this was now his life. In Legends, this would mark the first time that Obi-Wan heard Qui-Gon from beyond the grave, and as we proved, this is also the first time that Obi-Wan truly almost gave in to the dark side. We do want to mention that there were some other points where Kenobi was drawn to darkness, such as when he was on the planet of Zygula and was completely cut off from the light. There, Obi-Wan actually did have to use the dark side, but only because he was literally forced to. He had no alternative, and it didn't impact him long term. Here though, the situation was different because again, Obi-Wan wanted to turn. One might be able to force another to use the dark side, but until they give into it willingly, they will never truly experience its embrace. But luckily, Kenobi drew back like the true Jedi that he was. This account comes from the short story The Last One Standing, and it is an amazing read that perfectly encapsulates everything that we know about Obi-Wan, what he was going through during this time period, and the beginning of exile. I am still astounded by the parallels in this story, specifically how Obi-Wan and Anakin were in similar situations, and both of them heard the voice of Qui-Gon. Of course, only one of them actually listened, which resulted in the preferred ending. Again, at this time, Obi-Wan still had no knowledge of what Anakin had done to the Tuskens all those years ago, so the fact that he was able to cut down even more in Anakin's name was the most tragic part of the story. But anyway, my friends, please share with us your thoughts on this heartbreaking tale, and Obi-Wan's greatest pull to the dark side. And if you like us reviewing these lore-rich stories, be sure to let us know in the comments. Until next time, my friends, thank you so much for watching, may the Force be with you, and have an amazing day.